The price for Putin's war has been paid in blood. Putin's most sickening statistic has been revealed. Russia has officially suffered almost 1 million casualties in the war and is on track to break through the 1 million mark by the end of June. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which on June 4th reported figures unveiled by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. According to CSIS, the total number of casualties across the entire war is almost 1.4 million, with 400,000 of those casualties being accounted for by Ukraine. The rest, amounting to 950,000 troops, come from the Russian side. That's nearly 1 million Russians who have been killed, wounded, or captured since Putin started his full-scale invasion in February 2022. The CSIS figures go deeper. Of the 950,000 casualties, it says around 250,000 people have died on the Ukrainian battlefield in what the outlet calls a sign of Putin's blatant disregard for his own people. And it's hard to argue. At no point during the war has Putin attempted to change his tactics. If anything, he's grown even more reliant on the human wave strategy that's enabled him to take around 20% of Ukraine in the 3 years of attritional warfare. This approach, says the Kyiv Independent, is nowhere near as effective as Putin would like. Though he's captured 20% of Ukraine, most of that territory was taken during the early week of the invasion, when Russia shocked Ukraine with a surprise assault before being pushed back. Between January 2024 and today, Russia has only taken 1% of Ukraine. That averages out to about 164 square feet of Ukraine per day, at a cost of anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 soldiers daily. These are not the statistics that indicate that a war is going well. And even worse for Putin is that the CSIS figures may be slightly conservative. According to both Ukraine's general staff and the country's Ministry of Finance, Russia blew past 950,000 casualties months ago. Right now, both say Russia has actually lost 991,820 of its soldiers. If we assume an average loss of around 1,000 per day, that means it'll only be between 9 and 50 days before Russia breaks through the 1 million mark. By the end of summer, Putin is going to have hit a milestone he never thought possible. However, there are some caveats to these figures, as the Kyiv Independent points out. It says the human toll remains difficult to confirm due to the opacity on both sides, while pointing out that CSIS compiles its figures using estimates provided by defense officials in both the US and the UK, combined with satellite images of the battlefield. Other resources are more conservative. For instance, the Kyiv Independent said on May 26th that the BBC's Russian service and media Zona had confirmed only 109,600 Russian troop deaths. However, the journalists who provided those figures outright said that they're likely significantly higher, with the 109,600 figure only accounting for deaths they were able to confirm via public sources, such as obituaries, local media reports, and statements made by Russian authorities. The implication is that many of Russia's Ukraine war deaths aren't being reported, or may simply have been missed by the study. There are many reasons why these statistics should be devastating to Putin. Whether they actually are or not is a question that we'll answer later in the video. For now, information provided by The Economist allows us to dig even deeper into the statistics. It says that Russia's losses approaching the 1 million mark means it's exceeded its casualty rate for all other wars since World War II. Even Russia's campaign in Afghanistan, which lasted for a decade, didn't even come close. That war cost the then Soviet Union around 15,000 soldiers, according to the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. So the Ukraine war has been 66.6 times more devastating to Russia, despite only lasting a third of the amount of time of the Afghan war so far. The Economist also digs into the death figures initially reported by the BBC and Media Zona. It says that the figures those two resources came up with roughly tally with what we're seeing on the Ukrainian battlefield today, noting that 165,000 Russian men had died in the war by the end of 2024. That number comes from Russia's probate records for excess deaths. A staggering 90,000 men have been added to those records during the first half of 2025, The Economist said, suggesting that Russia is on the verge of losing 250,000 soldiers in total and may lose around 200,000 in 2025 alone. That death rate keeps up. The same resource also says that the rate of Russian wounded to killed is believed to be 4-to-1, owing in large part to not only the severity of the injuries Russian soldiers are receiving in Ukraine, but also the terrible medical treatment those soldiers receive. 4 multiplied by 250,000 deaths brings us right back to the 1 million figure. Another reason that the 1 million figure is credible, The Economist claims, is that many types of casualties can't necessarily be attributed to injuries sustained on the battlefield. Even in modern wars, many casualties are the result of secondary issues, such as famine, accidents, and the deliberate persecution of people in occupied territories. The resource brings up the Second Congo War, which raged from 1998 to 2003. That war is believed to have been responsible for 5.3 million deaths, most of them due to hunger and disease. The point being made here is that we can't rely on excess death records alone to determine Russia's casualty rate. Many deaths that resulted from the war, but weren't caused directly by battlefield injuries, may have not been counted as excess, blurring the figures in the process. One thing is for certain: Russia's casualty rate is far higher than Ukraine's. We mentioned earlier that CSIS estimates that Ukraine has lost around 400,000 soldiers over the last 3+ years. The Economist roughly concurs with that figure, noting that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said back in December that Ukraine had suffered 43,000 troop deaths and 370,000 injuries since February 2022. While that is likely an underestimate, The Economist says it still shows us that the rate of Ukrainian casualties is far lower than Russian casualties. All of these statistics lead us to an obvious question: how on earth did all of this happen? After all, Putin's special military operation was only supposed to last for a few days. Russia would roll into Ukraine practically unopposed, Putin thought back in February 2022, taking the entire country while barely losing a soldier. Of course, we know how badly that plan failed. Ukraine bravely pushed back against Putin's forces and has since received over $288 billion in military aid from its allies, according to the Kyiv Institute for the World Economy. That, combined with Ukraine's own innovations in areas like drone warfare, enables it to keep fighting and defend its territory. The war, in a nutshell, hasn't gone the way Putin wanted, and now he's willing to sacrifice as many people as it takes to make his dream of controlling Ukraine a reality. That brings us to the first reason Russia's casualty rate is so high: Putin's complete disregard. That disregard was noted way back in May 2022 when the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies questioned whether Putin even cares how much the war has cost him. At the time, the Ukraine war was only about 3 months deep. But even then, the claim was being made that Putin didn't care what his invasion had cost him. Russia had registered 20,000 casualties by this point, with the Davis Center noting that the number of casualties does not register in Russia the same way it does in the United States. One of the reasons for this is that Russia doesn't make its casualty rates public, with Putin preferring to pull the wool over people's eyes. The lack of a "leave no comrade behind" policy in the Russian army is also notable. Putin believes it's far more noble for his soldiers to sacrifice themselves for his cause. After all, there's plenty more where they came from. The point here is that Putin's callous disregard for his own people was known about early in the war, and there have been plenty more examples. For instance, in August 2024, CNN reported that Putin had promised his poorly trained conscripts that they wouldn't be sent to the Ukraine war's front lines. The problem Putin didn't foresee, and ultimately didn't care about, was that Ukraine could make advances. That month saw Ukraine launch an incursion into the Russian oblast of Kursk that ultimately required Putin to sacrifice over 62,400 of his soldiers to quell. So much for conscripts not having to fight. They were the soldiers pushed into the Kursk battle, showing us that Putin will happily break his promises to his own people if doing so gets him what he wants. Fast forward to January of this year, and Zelensky was making it clear just how little Putin cares about his people. Speaking during a 3-hour podcast with Lex Friedman, Zelensky said he does not love his people when referring to Putin. He only loves his inner circle, Ukraine's president claimed, when responding to a statement by Friedman that Putin is a serious person who loves his country. He's sending 18-year-old boys to die in war, Zelensky claimed. It's not that the fascists came to his country and he needs to defend it, he came to ours and sends them. This callousness in military philosophy leads us to a second, perhaps more practical, reason why Russia's casualty rate is on the verge of going past 1 million. Putin's human wave approach. So tactically inept is Russia's leader that he can come up with no other strategy than sending wave after wave of his soldiers to batter Ukraine's positions. That, coupled with launching huge numbers of missiles, bombs, and drones at Ukraine's cities, is the only way that Putin knows how to take territory. And it's a method that comes at a staggering cost to human life. The Economist points this out, noting that leading UK strategist Sir Lawrence Friedman says that Russia's human wave assaults are largely useless, grinding stuff. They also aren't likely to end anytime soon, but there are no signs of exhaustion, Friedman says. They are just carrying on. The lack of exhaustion seems to come from Putin alone, as his troops are certainly feeling the pain of the Russian leader's approach. Again, we come back to something we said earlier. Putin believes there will always be more soldiers to draw upon, more warm bodies to send into Ukraine. As long as Putin has that supply, he'll never be exhausted. The reality of this approach is brutal. Back in July 2024, the BBC spoke to Lieutenant Colonel Anton Bayev, who serves with the Katyia Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard. He said that Russia often sends wave after wave of soldiers, often within the space of a couple of hours, to bombard Ukraine's defensive positions. The Russians use these units in most cases purely to see where our firing equipment is located and to constantly exhaust our units, Bayev told the BBC. Our guys stand in positions and fight, and when 4 or 5 waves of the enemy come at you in one day, which you have to destroy without end, it's very difficult, not only physically, but also psychologically. The BBC dubbed this approach meat assaults, and Putin is using it to break the collective Ukrainian military psyche. At least, he's trying. Hitting 1 million casualties in exchange for 20% of Ukraine's territory, and only having gained 1% of Ukraine since 2024, tells us that Putin's approach is failing. Also in July 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that Putin isn't happy to just use healthy soldiers in his human wave assaults. Those who've sustained injuries are also being sent back to the front lines before they're ready, simply to absorb Ukrainian fire. One Ukrainian soldier, identified only by call sign Hunter, said that wounded Russian soldiers are simply left in positions to die. This confirms what the Davis Center says about Russia not having a leave no man behind policy. Putin doesn't care about that. A wounded soldier dying in Ukraine equates to a body that successfully soaked up some ammunition that can't be fired at the next wave he sends into an attack. The Economist says there's another reason why Russia's casualty rate is so high. Putin is able to take advantage of his position as a de facto dictator to send as many of his people into war as he likes. Ukraine, The Economist says, is a democracy that only has about a quarter of the population of Russia. As a democracy, Ukraine has to be seen to be concerned about the welfare of its soldiers. We see that concern manifested in Zelensky's words and the ratio of Ukrainian wounded to killed. That ratio is about 8-1, roughly half of Russia's ratio, which tells us that Ukraine makes much more of an effort to pull its wounded from the battlefield rather than leaving them to die, as seems to be Putin's approach. Russia's leader can only pull off this approach because he's essentially a dictator. That position gives him control over state media, which he uses to fuel propaganda and hide the true cost of his invasion from the very people he's trying to convince to fight for him. Ukraine doesn't have that option. It can't trick its people into entering a war from which they're unlikely to ever return, both because Ukraine is a democracy and due to the war happening inside Ukraine. Ukraine's people can see the war. It's an ever-present specter in Ukrainian life. Russia, on the other hand, is far more shielded. Sure, there are occasional attacks on Russian territory and the issues like the Kursk counter-invasion with which Putin has to contend, but by and large, he's free to constantly lie about what's really happening to Russia's soldiers on the front lines, with his position as a dictator allowing him to use Russia's media to sell those lies. There's one final reason why Russia's casualty rate is so high. Losing soldiers in war is baked into the country's culture. Geneva Solutions pointed this out back in May 2022, noting that Putin taking an attritional approach to Ukraine after his initial invasion failed shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. It's how Russia always fights its wars. Rely on superior manpower to wear down an opponent. This culture may date as far back as the Battle of Narva in 1700. That battle saw Russia suffer a heavy defeat against Sweden, which saw its leader, Tsar Peter the Great, weep over losing so many of his personal friends in the battle. The legend goes that in response to Peter's grief, one of his closest advisors put a hand on his shoulder and uttered some famous words. "Don't cry, my lord. Russian mothers will produce more sons." The die was cast for Russia's approach to warfare, and it hasn't strayed much since. We saw it during the Soviet-Finnish War, Geneva Solutions says, in which 8 Russians were killed for every Finnish death. The storming of Berlin in 1945, which should have been a display of Russia's final victory over Nazi Germany, cost the country over 300,000 of its soldiers. In contrast, the US lost 290,000 of its soldiers in battle throughout the entirety of World War II, Geneva Solutions says. Mass casualties are part of the Russian way of war. Putin has seen no reason to change that, as he believes that he's making enough progress in Ukraine to justify the sheer scale of his country's losses. Now that Russia is about to break the 1 million mark, what happens next is simple. Putin will keep pushing. More Russians will die. This is highlighted by the fact that Russia is still recruiting between 30,000 and 40,000 soldiers per month, says the Kyiv Independent. To pull that off, Russia is offering massive financial rewards to those who sign up for military service. The Economist says that these rewards are often life-changing sums of money. Most of Russia's soldiers, it says, come from poor provincial towns and are now in their 30s and 40s. These are typically men who have families to support and have never seen anything close to the signing-on bonuses of around $15,000 Putin is offering, never mind the average annual pay they receive, which is 5 times the size of the average Russian salary. Even if that poor soldier is eventually killed, Russia pays the family up to 19 million rubles, which amounts to nearly $240,000, for the sacrifice. As long as Putin has the cash, he'll keep recruiting more soldiers to his military, and that means we'll carry on seeing death on a massive scale. How long can Putin maintain this approach is the only question that's still up for debate. On May 12th, Business Insider wrote that Russia has spent so much on the Ukraine war that it's on the verge of running out of liquid reserves. By the fall, those reserves will be exhausted, it says, having already dwindled to $31 billion from the $117 billion Russia had in 2021. Running out of those reserves won't stop Putin. He still has money coming in from oil and gas sales, and he's transformed Russia's economy to become wholly reliant on war. But it will hinder his approach, especially as the loss of those reserves will affect those living in Russia due to massive budget cuts made to public services. Will Putin care? His track record in the Ukraine war tells us anything. Probably not. He'll expect his people at home to sacrifice just as much as those on the battlefield when the money runs out. That, combined with his terrible human wave tactic, means that the 1 million figure Russia has officially reached for casualties is just the beginning. Many more hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of Russians will become casualties of Putin's war, all because of his disregard for his people and his terrible tactics. Speaking of terrible tactics, Finland's president recently humiliated Putin by pointing out all of the massive military blunders Russia's leader has made during the war. Check out our video where we cover how Finland humiliated Poland, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for the most accurate and up-to-date videos covering the Ukraine war.